if you look at Europe, hundreds of people have been killed by radical Islamists in Europe over the past 5 or 6 years. Hundreds. In Paris, in Nice, in Berlin, in Barcelona, in London, in Manchester. And it very rarely causes any kind of serious long-term discussion or reflection. And instead, what we have are people trying to brush it under the carpet. If we encourage people to see words as violent, you are going to make people feel incredibly fragile when they hear criticism. And the worst thing is, if you look at something like the massacre at Charlie Hebdo, that is arguably the logical extension of this idea. Because if you go around saying, for example, that it's unacceptable for anyone to criticize your religion, if they criticize your religion, that's punching down, it's a form of racism, they're really humiliating you, they're really demonizing you, and it's completely unacceptable for people to criticize Islam. Of course, you're going to make people feel that criticism of Islam deserves some kind of punishment. Now, the punishment might be no platforming them from university, as happened to Mariam Namazi, the Iranian secularist who was no platform. Or it might mean losing your job. We saw that man at Asda, an ordinary working class granddad at Asda who lost his job because he shared a Billy Connolly video online which criticized Islam and other religions. Or take it to its extreme conclusion, and it could mean physically punishing someone, which is what the killers at Charlie Hebdo did. I've always seen that massacre as essentially the armed wing of political correctness, because what those two blokes were saying is essentially, we're going to meet violence with violence, and your insults of Islam are so horrific and horrendous and demeaning that we are going to punish you in the highest way possible. That's the danger of censorship. People always say that the danger with freedom of speech is it could whip up poisonous sentiments and give rise to violence. I think censorship is more likely to give rise to violence, because if you encourage people to think that their belief system or their political ideas or their identity are beyond reproach and can never be criticized and are perfect and pristine, and any criticism of them is essentially blasphemy, that's more likely to cause violent situations. That's more likely to cause mob behavior. So I think censorship is a greater cause of at least violent attitudes than freedom of speech is.
Yeah, the Mariam Namazi example, which you mentioned, is actually just, that's quite a seminal moment for me in general, just because she's a left-wing Iranian secularist, and she'd come to Goldsmiths in the UK and a bunch of other universities to give a talk about basically why she's an atheist and why she opposes Islamism, which is currently the dominant regime in Iran, where I think she's from. And I think it was some super progressives, it's like the Feminist Society, the LGBTQ Society, and the Islamic Society, all basically ganged up and tried to no platform her, which in my view, as someone who tries to get past the groupthink and think about what I genuinely think is a moral way to think about stuff and a rational way to think about stuff, struck me as really irrational, because you've got the Feminist Society and the LGBTQ Society and the Islamic Society siding with Islamism, which is often deeply hostile to all those different modes of thought and groups. And just the intensity of the groupthink overrides actually rationally thinking, okay, the progressive person here, or the progressive approach to this is to at least allow an Iranian feminist secularist to speak in the UK and not to side with theocrats, some of whom who were trying to shout her down really aggressively and said really kind of radical, really super homophobic stuff in public and didn't face any consequences for it and weren't no platformed. But I think the discussion around radical Islam is just in particular another good example of where groupthink often overrides what should take precedence, which I think is what's best or the most rational way to discuss the issue. And that's something you've discussed quite a lot. So could you go into some detail about kind of how you see the left or the progressive approach to that issue and what its failings are?
Yeah, I just think the left today, and not just the radical left, but the mainstream left and even liberals, are incredibly reluctant to face up to the problem of radical Islam, and even reluctant to face up to the problem of violent Islam. They are incredibly cagey about having this discussion. It was really brought home to me when there was the Charlottesville, when the guy in Charlottesville drove his car into a bunch of protesters and one young woman died. A horrific act, a bunch of far-right lunatics who basically has attacked these left-wing protesters, and one woman was killed. It was horrendous. And that became this galvanizing moment for the left across the Western world. I mean, it became their reference point, and they said, this proves we have to stand up to fascism and violence. A few days later, in Barcelona, a radical Islamist drove a car down a busy street, and I think he killed 14 people, including a very, very young child. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Of course, it got loads of newspaper coverage. It was on the front pages. Of course, we were all encouraged to feel sad and to put the Spanish flag on our Facebook pages and all that stuff. There was no galvanizing moment. There was no discussion about the problem of Islamofascism, as one might refer to it. No discussion about needing to galvanize against these, galvanize ourselves against these forces, against these regressive forces, against this regressive violence. Nothing. And that double standard, I think, really cuts to the heart of the left's inability or unwillingness to talk about radical Islam, because they're obsessed with the far right and white supremacists, who I think, if you were talking earlier about looking at statistics and facts, the far right and white supremacists are less of a threat than radical Islamists. And that's just a fact. If you look at Europe, hundreds of people have been killed by radical Islamists in Europe over the past 5 or 6 years, hundreds. In Paris, in Nice, in Berlin, in Barcelona, in London, in Manchester, and it very rarely causes any kind of serious long-term discussion or reflection. And instead, what we have are people trying to brush it under the carpet. You know, don't focus on this too long, or don't look back in anger, as they said after the Manchester Arena bombing. You know, lay a flower, move on, shut the hell up. And anyone who does talk about it runs the risk of being called Islamophobic, divisive, racist, and so on. I would argue that I think that there are two things driving this unwillingness to talk about radical Islam. The first is just abject moral cowardice, and really a depraved form of moral cowardice in terms of an unwillingness to face up to the divisions in your own society, which have become so intense that there are people within your own society who are willing to blow up children, or are willing to mow down people celebrating Bastille Day in Nice. When that happens, there ought to be a very long, serious discussion about the problems in society, or the problems with certain forms of ideology that have taken hold. But this abject moral cowardice means they're just unwilling to do that, because they're unwilling to call into question anything to do with multiculturalism or anything to do with those kinds of phenomena. So the first thing is just a cowardice to face up to the problem. And the second thing is I think there's a racist component to it too, because it's often driven by this notion that Muslims, radical Muslims, aren't really in control of what they're doing, right? It's not really their fault. They're probably victims themselves. You know, they were led astray by someone on the internet, and they were taken down a dark path, and it's all horrible, but let's forget about it. They would never say that about a far-right terrorist. They would never say, oh, poor little far-right terrorist, he was led astray by someone on the internet, and he had his head filled with poisonous ideas, and he did this terrible thing, but let's not dwell on it. They do that in relation to radical Muslims because they have this tendency to infantilize Muslims and to see Muslims as a special group, kind of a slightly pathetic group, a slightly weak group, who aren't 100% in control of their lives and who are in a very unfortunate position in society. I think there's a slightly racist element to that. My concern, I like living in a mixed society. I like living in a society that has people from different parts of the world, people with different cultures. I think that's great. My parents are immigrants, so I'm a first generation Briton. My family's only been here for 50 years. We're complete newcomers. So that's great. That's wonderful. But we also have to ask how it's possible to have a society in which that can happen, but everyone feels part of society. Everyone feels that they belong. Everyone feels part of a kind of cohering culture or a cohering national story. And the failure to do that at the moment, and the preference for pushing a divisive politics of identity, I think that's one of the core problems we face. And it's really grating against the possibility of having a truly integrated society.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing a point you raised there is basically the bigotry of low expectations. That's the phrase which Majid uses, which I have a lot of. I could definitely understand that point of view. So I think that there's definitely an element to which people, there's an aspect to the reluctance to call out radicalism, which is motivated by good intentions, which is a desire to prevent any form of backlash and not to paint the picture of all Muslims as evil, which is obviously a really racist point of view. And some people do fall foul of thinking in that way and expressing those views. So I can understand the desire to protect or like kind of shield groups from over like too much scrutiny or too much criticism where it's not warranted. But at the same time, it's, as you say, it's basically saying that the whole ideology itself is kind of can be generalized to all Muslims, and that by criticizing radical Islam, you might be being offensive to the vast majority of peaceful, non-violent Muslims in the country who actually have complete contempt for that worldview and are in no way violent. And I think there's definitely an aspect of just complete doublethink there. It's something else which stood out to me about that is the way in which kind of every time there's a really violent Islamist attack in the world across the West, it's basically met by a really weird reluctance to actually call out the ideology behind it, which is what you're mentioning. So it's like when Shamima Begum went to join ISIS, the vast majority of the left-wing commentary that I saw on that was quite sympathetic towards her, or basically painting her as the victim. I just think that the whole approach to me stands out as quite irrational.
Yeah, I think the well, just briefly on your point about good intentions, you know what they say about the road to hell, and I think that's really true in this situation, because as you've just suggested, I think one of the key problems with being unwilling to criticize radical Islam is that it has a really detrimental impact on Muslim communities. Because Muslim communities are probably more keen than anyone else to get to grips with the problem of radical Islam. They don't want these radical young blokes at their mosques who might at some point go off and commit some horrendous crime. I'm sure they have an incredibly vested interest in making sure that this problem is addressed. A recent poll found that Muslims were more keen than other sections of society to report someone if they thought they were becoming radicalized. You know, they're very concerned about these problems. And I think the unwillingness to confront radical Islam on the basis that it might cause problems for the Muslim community, is deeply, deeply patronizing. It's such a white middle class form of patronizing behavior. It really is up there with the worst forms of it. But also it does precisely what it's trying not to do. So it's trying not to tar all Muslims with the brush of being radical Islamists, which I think we absolutely should not do. But it ends up doing that because it says, you know, this lunatic who blew up 20 children at the Manchester Arena, we can't possibly focus on him too much because that might be offensive to ordinary Muslims. Ordinary Muslims who would never in a million years dream of blowing themselves up at Manchester Arena. So it actually is, they completely shoot themselves in the foot. And even worse, they do damage to the Muslim community by presenting them as almost as an infantile community that needs protection, but also one which at some level has something in common with the guy at Manchester Arena or the guy at London Bridge or the guy at Westminster Bridge. And that's such a dangerous argument.